A battlefield in the ancient world. Dust and noise. Iron striking iron. Horses screaming, rearing, bolting in every direction, as chaos closes in around them. And in the middle of that chaos, one horse stands still, not frozen in fear, not broken in spirit. Coiled, alert, its full strength held ready, waiting on the smallest signal, from the man on its back. That horse has a name in ancient Greek. It is called praus. Sit with that word for a second, because it is the exact word Jesus used on a hillside in Galilee, when he said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And if the picture in your head just now was a timid animal, a passive animal, an animal too weak to cause any trouble, you have the wrong horse entirely. The horse, the ancient world called praus, was not the weakest animal on the battlefield. It was often the most powerful one there. The difference was not strength. The difference was where that strength was pointed and who was allowed to direct it. This is the story of a word that got quietly turned into its opposite, and a beatitude that has been misread by nearly everyone who has ever heard it in English. To understand what went wrong, you have to start with the horse itself, because that is where the ancient Greeks first put this word to work. In the world of Aristotle, and the military writers who came after him, a wild horse was of no use to anyone. It might have tremendous power in its legs and its lungs. It might be able to outrun anything on the field. But raw power with no direction is just chaos waiting to happen. And an army cannot build a cavalry charge out of chaos. So horses were broken, trained, disciplined, sometimes for years, by handlers who worked patiently to bring that raw power under control. And here is the detail that changes everything. The goal of that training was never to drain the horse of its strength. A tame horse with no power left in it was worthless in battle, just as worthless as a wild one that couldn't be controlled. The goal was to keep every bit of the horse's strength fully intact and simply place it under command. A trained warhorse could still crush a man beneath its hooves. It could still charge through a wall of enemy soldiers without flinching. The strength never left the animal. What changed was its posture toward its rider. It had learned, through long and patient training, to hold all of that power in perfect readiness, waiting for direction, rather than acting on its own instinct. That controlled, disciplined, battle-ready animal is exactly what the Greeks called praus. Picture the two horses side by side on the same field. One is untamed, and the moment the fighting starts, it panics, rears, and throws its rider into the mud, its power working against the very army it was meant to serve. The other is praus, trained, steady, and in the middle of the same chaos, it stands its ground, muscles coiled, completely ready to charge, the instant its rider gives the signal. Nobody watching that second horse would ever call it the weak one. Every soldier on that field would tell you the exact opposite. The disciplined horse was the valuable one. The wild horse was the liability. That is the word Jesus reaches for. Now watch what he actually says with it. He does not use this word only for horses. Of course, by the time of the New Testament, praus and its noun form, prautes, had become one of the most respected qualities a person could carry, precisely because it described this same picture, applied to a human character. Aristotle himself wrote about it directly. In his famous discussion of virtue as the balance between two extremes, he places praus as the golden mean, sitting exactly between two failures. On one side sits orgalotes, uncontrolled rage, a temper that explodes without restraint. On the other side sits a different failure, a spinelessness that cannot summon anger, even when anger is exactly what a situation calls for. Prautes sits in the middle. Not the absence of passion, not the absence of strength. The right amount of both, held under command, released at the right moment, for the right reason. So a praus person, in the vocabulary of the world Jesus was speaking into, was never a doormat. It was a person of real strength, real capability, sometimes real power, who had learned to hold all of that under discipline, rather than letting it run wild. Strength, not weakness. Strength, under control. Now go back to the Beatitude itself, and feel how differently it lands. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. This is not a blessing pronounced over the weak, the passive, the people too timid to ever assert themselves. It is a blessing pronounced over the people who carry real strength and have chosen, deliberately, to keep that strength under someone else's command. And in context, whose command that is could not be clearer. The whole Sermon on the Mount is about a kingdom where God is the one holding the reins. Here's where the popular English reading starts to come apart. Though, because meek has not stayed still in our own language, any more than it stayed still on its way from Hebrew and Greek. The English word meek descends from an old Germanic root that originally carried something closer to soft or gentle, but over centuries of use, it drifted further and further toward weakness, timidity, and an inability to stand up for yourself. Somewhere in that drift, the word picked up a faint smell of doormat. Say, he was meek in modern English, and most people picture someone who gets stepped on and says nothing. That is precisely the opposite of the trained warhorse standing steady in the middle of the battlefield. And once you see that shrinking, the pattern shows up everywhere else the word appears in the New Testament. Look at where else praus and prouts turn up, and you can watch the strength under control meaning. Hold firm every single time. Jesus describes himself with this exact word. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For I am gentle and lowly in heart. The Greek there is praus. This is the same man who overturned tables in the temple with a whip of cords. The same man who stood in front of religious leaders and called them exactly what they were without flinching. The same man who walked calmly toward a cross he had every power in heaven to avoid. Nobody who reads the full picture of Jesus in the Gospels could honestly call him weak or passive. He was praus. Immense strength, entirely surrendered to his Father's direction. Watch it again in the way he entered Jerusalem. The prophet Zechariah had promised that Israel's king would come, righteous and having salvation, and then adds this detail. Humble, gentle, praus, mounted on a donkey. A king riding into his capital city had every reason to arrive on a warhorse, trailing military strength behind him. Jesus rides in on a borrowed colt instead. Not because he had no power. The Gospels are relentlessly clear that he had all of it. He simply chose, deliberately, to display that power under restraint, rather than on parade. That is praus on full display in a single image. Paul reaches for the same word when he wants to describe how he approaches the church at Corinth. I, Paul, myself entreat you, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. The same Paul who could write blistering, unflinching correction when a situation called for it, chooses this word to describe his posture because praus was never about having no backbone. It was about having plenty of backbone held on a leash. James tells his readers that the wisdom from above shows itself through good conduct. In the meekness of wisdom, pairing genuine wisdom directly with this same disciplined strength, rather than with softness for its own sake. Paul lists praus among the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians, right alongside self-control, because the two ideas are practically cousins. And in Colossians, believers are told to put on, like clothing, compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Every item on that list describes a strength that has learned restraint, not a strength that never existed in the first place. Quick word before we keep going. If studies like this are helping you read your Bible with fresh eyes, the best way to support this channel is to subscribe and leave a comment. It genuinely helps these videos reach people searching for exactly this. And if you're already part of this community, thank you. So if praus means disciplined strength rather than weakness, the Beatitude opens up in a way it never could before. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Is not a blessing for people who have nothing to offer, quietly waiting on the sidelines while the strong take everything. It is a blessing for people who have real strength, real capability, real power in whatever form that takes in their life, and have chosen to place all of it under God's direction, instead of their own. The earth is not promised to the powerless. It is promised to the powerful, who have learned restraint. That single distinction changes what this Beatitude is actually asking of you. It is not asking you to shrink. It is not asking you to disappear, stay silent when silence causes harm, or let yourself be endlessly walked over and call that holiness. It is asking whether the strength you already carry, whatever shape it takes, is answering to God's reins, or running wild on its own instinct. It's worth being honest about where the doormat reading came from, because this misunderstanding did real damage over the centuries, and naming its source matters. As the English word meek drifted toward weakness, this Beatitude got pulled along with it. And in some times and places, it was preached in ways that told people, especially people already vulnerable to mistreatment, that enduring abuse in silence was the same thing as Christian virtue. That reading has caused genuine harm to people who needed to hear that God gave them a voice, not a life sentence of silent endurance. That was never what the word meant. And it was never what Jesus was describing when he pointed to a trained warhorse standing steady under its rider's hand. But we have to be careful walking the other direction too, because there is a ditch on that side just as real as the first one. Recovering strength under control does not mean praus is secretly a call to be forceful, dominant, or always ready to display power for its own sake. That reading misses the word just as badly, only from the opposite angle. The trained warhorse is not valuable because it charges wildly at every provocation. It is valuable precisely because its power stays under command, until command is actually needed. A person who mistakes meekness for permission to flex strength whenever they feel like it has simply swapped one misunderstanding for another. The virtue is not the strength itself. It is the discipline that holds it, ready and restrained, until the moment calls for it. Picture a young colt on a hillside farm, not yet broken, wild in every direction its legs will carry it. Left alone, it is a danger to itself and to anyone near it, throwing its full strength at whatever startles it, with no judgment guiding where that strength goes. A trainer comes, patient, unhurried, working with that colt month after month, never trying to break its spirit, never trying to drain away the power in its legs and lungs. The goal was never a weaker horse. The goal was a horse whose full strength had learned to answer to a rider's hand. Years pass. That same horse stands now on a battlefield, arrows overhead, the ground shaking with the thunder of other animals in full panic around it. And it does not run. It does not throw its rider into the mud. It holds, muscles coiled, breath steady, every ounce of power it has ever possessed gathered and ready, waiting on the lightest touch of the rein, to release it in exactly the right direction, at exactly the right moment. That is not a weak animal. That is the animal every soldier on that field would want carrying them into danger. Its strength was never smaller than the wild colt's strength. It was simply no longer its own to spend. So where does this land for you? Maybe you have spent years believing meekness means making yourself smaller, staying silent about things that deserved a voice, letting people walk over you and calling the damage humility. Hear this clearly. That was never what the word meant, and it is not what is being asked of you. You are allowed to have strength. You are allowed to have a voice. The question was never whether you have power. The question is whether that power answers to God's hand, or runs wild on its own instinct. Or maybe your struggle runs the other direction. Maybe you have always prided yourself on strength, on never backing down, on meeting every challenge with force, because that has always felt like the safer posture. If that's you, Let the warhorse challenge you gently. Its strength was never the problem. Its strength unchecked, running on its own instinct in the middle of chaos, would have been the problem. Praus is asking whether you are willing to let your strength answer to something outside yourself, even when everything in you wants to charge ahead on your own terms. And maybe you are simply tired of a word that has been used against you your whole life. A word that told you to stay quiet, stay small, stay compliant, and called all of that a virtue. The word was never asking that of you. It never once described a horse with nothing left inside it. It described a horse whose full power was finally safe in someone else's hands. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Not the passive, not the powerless, the disciplined. The ones whose strength has learned to wait on God's word before it moves, the way a trained animal waits, coiled and ready. For a rider, it has learned to trust completely. That is the inheritance this beatitude actually promises. Not a reward for having nothing, a reward for placing everything you have exactly where it was always meant to go. If this changed the way you hear that word today, subscribe, leave a comment below, and share it with someone who has carried real strength their whole life and never once heard that it was welcome at the feet of Jesus. God bless you.